This is the second video that covers the skeletal system. In the last video, we talked about bone development in a fetus, and now we're going to look at bone growth after birth. So when bones grow, they can grow lengthwise, which is called interstitial or longitudinal growth, and they can grow in thickness, which is called appositional growth. So we're going to first look at interstitial growth, and then we'll briefly look at appositional growth. We're first going to look at interstitial growth, or the growth that makes long bones longer. This type of growth, all is going to originate around the epiphyseal plate, right here. And so the epiphyseal plate includes 5 different zones. So we're just going to go through each of those zones. The first zone right here is often called the resting zone or the quiescent zone. In this illustration, it's called the reserve zone. This area, not much is happening. We just have some cartilage, so we can see the chondrocytes and their surrounding matrix. The next zone is called the proliferation zone. And in the proliferation zone is where these chondrocytes are rapidly dividing through mitosis. Okay, so we have lots and lots of new cells. And these new cells that are formed are going to move upward, pushing the epiphysis away from the diaphysis. So these new cells are kind of pushing upward, and further separating the epiphysis from the diaphysis. So the next zone is the hypertrophic zone. And so hypertrophy is something getting bigger. And so here we have chondrocytes that are maturing and getting bigger. Okay, and the cartilage, the matrix that's surrounding them starting to break down a little bit and erode. Okay. The next zone that we're looking at is the calcification zone. So this is where the matrix that's surrounding the chondrocytes hardens with calcium. And now, so this is not turned into a bone. This is hardening of the cartilage. And because the matrix surrounding the chondrocytes is hardened, those chondrocytes are going to die and start to break down because they have no blood vessels, they have no oxygen, all the things that cells need. The final region is called the ossification zone, and this is where that cartilage gets turned into bone. So the dead chondrocytes are going to break down, and they leave behind these kind of pointy spicules. Okay, and the spicules are just made out of calcified cartilage matrix. And so that calcified cartilage matrix can be broken down by osteoclasts. We've talked about osteoclasts as the bone crushers. Well, osteoclasts can break down anything that has a lot of calcium in it, any of the supportive connective tissue. So these osteoclasts can also break down cartilage. And so they're going to break down the cartilage that was left over from these dead chondrocytes. Over time, the area where the osteoclasts have broken down the cartilage, new bone is going to be replaced by osteoblasts. Remember, osteoblasts are the bone builders. Okay, and eventually that's going to be replaced with spongy bone, so on and so forth. And so this goes on until about adolescence, right? If it's for a female, bone growth, long bone growth ends around 14 to 18. Males ends around 21. And the way that this ends is that epiphyseal plate is going to get thinner and thinner, eventually being fully replaced by bone. And so when you look at a X-ray of a bone that's actively growing, you'll see kind of a space at that epiphyseal plate. But when you look at an X-ray of a bone that has finished growing, you're not going to see that space. You can also see the remnants of the epiphyseal plate in bones that we have in lab, and like the real bone specimens that we've had cut in half. you can see just a very thin line. So that epiphyseal plate is going to, again, get converted into bone, and then it's called the epiphyseal line. There are some bones that grow your entire life, and so those bones include your facial bones. And so long bones do not grow past puberty, but your facial bones are going to keep on growing because they are going to grow through apositional growth. Okay, they grow far more slowly than your long bones do, though. So don't worry, you're not going to end up with a nose that's 10 feet long. It's worth noting that bone growth is regulated by hormones. And so thyroid hormone is going to modulate the activity of growth hormone, and then growth hormone acts directly on bone. In addition, testosterone and estrogen also act on bone. And if you take lab with me, I talked about how the bones of the jaw and kind of upper neck area are going to be much wider in somebody who has more testosterone. The hips and somebody whose primary androgen is estrogen are going to be much wider. So these hormones have direct effects on the shape of the bodies that are exposed to them. So whenever you have a deficit in any of these hormones, you're going to end up with abnormal skeletal growth, maybe differently shaped bones or smaller stature. If you have an excess, you can end up with really, really long, really, really thick bones. You may have thought that we must be at the end of all the different kind of forms of development and growth with bone, but we're far from it. We still have to talk about bone remodeling. So many of us think of bones as these kind of hard, almost stone-like structures that don't change throughout our lifetimes, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Bone is living tissue, and it's changing all the time. About 5 to 7% of your bone mass is going to be recycled each week, which means that when we're looking at spongy bone, all the spongy bone in your body will be replaced every 3 to 4 years. All the compact bone in your body will be replaced about every 10 years. So bone remodeling includes both osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So that means that bone is being deposited as well as being reabsorbed. And bone remodeling occurs on both the periosteal surface and the endosteal surface. We're first going to look at bone resorption. And bone resorption is done by osteoclasts. Remember, the bone crushers. And so those osteoclasts are going to kind of dig into the bone down here. And then they're going to kind of break down the matrix. The way that they break down that matrix is by secreting lysosomal enzymes and also some protons. And so if you haven't taken chemistry in a long time, a proton can just be called an H+, right? So a hydrogen plus ion. And those act like acids. So the lysosomal enzymes and the protons or hydrogen acid is going to break down and convert the calcium salts that are in bone into soluble forms of calcium that can travel through the bloodstream. Okay? Osteoclasts are also going to phagocytize or eat up the demineralized matrix and any dead osteocytes. Those digested products are going to be released into the interstitial fluid and then get into the blood. Once osteoclasts are done, their life is done. Okay, so once the osteoclasts have done the job of breaking down bone, they actually undergo apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. Osteoclasts are relatively short-lived compared to some of the other bone cells. Osteoclasts are activated by parathyroid hormone and also some immune T cells, and we'll talk more about that shortly. This other side talks about bone deposition. So bone deposition, or the depositing of new bone, is going to require osteoblasts, the bone builders. Okay, and so we can see those osteoblasts kind of anchoring themselves into the bone and eventually kind of laying a bunch of new matrix here. And some of these osteoblasts are going to get trapped in the matrix, developing into osteocytes. We often like to say that bone remodeling is stimulated by mechanical stress and controlled by hormonal controls. What I mean by this is that bone is going to thicken in response to twisting, torsion, mechanical stress. But the rate at which that happens is hormonally controlled. So I mentioned parathyroid hormone and how that's involved with bone resorption. So parathyroid hormone, remember, is going to check blood calcium levels. If blood calcium is too low, it's going to tell those osteoclasts to break down more bone, releasing calcium into the blood. When blood calcium levels are high, calcitonin is going to be released. And calcitonin has an effect of increasing bone production by osteoblasts. So there's a little bit of a give and take. But as I mentioned in your textbook and as I've mentioned before, it's not a perfect relationship. Parathyroid hormone has a very significant impact on blood calcium levels, and calcitonin, though at the levels in our body, has a very low impact on blood calcium levels. Going back to the mechanical stress, this is this concept called Wolff's Law. And so Wolff's Law states that bones grow or remodel in response to the demands that are placed on them. So stress of bones is usually a little bit off center, so we have bones that are actually bending a little bit. And if you think about bending a bone, it's going to compress one side and stretch the other side. And so if one side is compressed and the other side is stretched, you can see how that would affect the bone remodeling, right? If bone is remodeling in response to mechanical stress. So the diaphysis is going to be thickest where bending stresses are greatest. And bone can also be hollow in places because if you think about compression and tension, those are going to cancel each other out somewhere near the center of bone. Wolff's Law is also used to explain a bunch of other things. So if you are right-handed, the bones on your right arm and hand are going to be thicker than if you're left-handed. If you look at people's femurs, some of you are going to notice very curved bones, and those are in response to mechanical stress in the femurs. Okay, those trabeculae, those columns that we see in spongy bone, those trabeculae actually form in areas where there's stress. I've mentioned in lab how fetal skeletons have very few bumps. All those landmarks that we learned, for the most part, develop during the course of our lifetime. So like the greater trochanters and the tibial tuberosity, those types of landmarks are in response to the pull of muscles on that bone. So again, just to reiterate the concept I was trying to explain at the beginning, when we're looking at hormones, hormones are the control. They control whether or not remodeling is going to occur, right? What are the blood calcium levels? Do we need to remove some bone so there's higher blood calcium levels? Do we need to deposit some bone so there's lower blood calcium levels? So again, hormones control whether remodeling occurs. Mechanical stress determines where it occurs. We're next going to look at fractures, and I don't spend a lot of time on fracture classification. Those of you who are going into our Rad Tech program will get far more information in the Rad Tech program. I just want you to kind of get an idea of some of these different types of fractures. So when we're looking at fractures, so first I'm going to look at the closed and the open fracture. So here is a closed fracture and here is an open fracture. So the difference between a closed and an open fracture is that the open fracture goes through the skin. Okay, this is often also called a compound fracture. There are transverse fractures where the impact kind of goes towards the center. There is a spiral fracture where the fracture is going to go around the diaphysis of a long bone. We have comminuted fractures where there's a lot of little small bone fragments. We have impacted fractures where the pressure and force has gone up. We have a little green stick fracture, which is just kind of like almost like a splinter of bone has broken away. And then we have the oblique fracture where it's kind of on an oblique line. Now we're going to look at fracture repair. And so assuming that a fracture has left the bone in alignment, nothing additional needs to be done other than stabilizing that bone so it can repair itself. If a fracture is an open fracture or a compound fracture, that fracture is going to have to be set before the bone starts to heal. So when we're looking at bone repair, the first thing that happens is that it's essentially like a bruise, an internal bruise happens. So here, this is called a hematoma, okay? And again, this is where blood kind of gets captured under the periosteum. But the blood is clotted and it kind of holds things together. During this phase of repair, the site is very swollen, painful, and inflamed. Okay? The next step, we're going to have a fibrocartilage callus formed. And so here we have a callus that's formed, and it's kind of like joint compound, just kind of patching the bone up while it can heal. So again, this is made of fibrocartilage, and it's able to occur because we have these new blood vessels bringing nutrients in. We've had phagocytes that have cleared out any of the debris, and then we have these fibroblasts that are going to secrete collagen fibers, making that nice fibrocartilage callus. Okay? The next step is going to be when the fibrocartilage callus is converted into a bony callus. So here we have that fibrocartilage callus, and here we see we're getting the bony callus. So it's moved from being cartilage to actual bone tissue. But you'll notice that this bony callus is still wider than the original bone. Okay? So the last thing that has to happen is bone remodeling. And so those osteoclasts are going to break down kind of the wider parts of the bone. If part of the bone didn't get quite as wide as it needs to, we can have some osteoblasts laying some more matrix down. But the bone remodeling is the last part, and that takes the longest. So again, we have a hematoma where blood rushes to the area. This is very painful, lots of inflammation and swelling, but it does its best to stabilize the broken bone initially. After the hematoma, we are going to get some new blood vessels in the area. We're going to have fibroblasts forming fibrocartilage, and we're going to get what's called a fibrocartilage callus. The next step is that fibrocartilage callus gets turned into a bony callus, and last but not least, remodeling occurs so that the bone looks pretty similar to what it looked like originally. So we can see that this area is wider, but it's not nearly as wide as it was during the repair process. I hope you found this video covering longitudinal growth, oppositional growth, and bone repair helpful. If you have any questions, please post it to the community help forum.